Before you go any further, pause for a moment. Place your hand on your chest, take a slow breath, and allow yourself to settle into this moment. What you're about to read isn't just another piece of content. It carries something meaningful, something that may feel as though it was written specifically for you. If these words found their way to you today, trust that there may be a reason for it. Certain truths seem to arrive only when we're finally ready to hear them. Here's something worth reflecting on. There is someone out there who has been thinking about you, not casually, not once in a while, but deeply and consistently. They've been carrying thoughts of you in their heart without saying a word. And something is beginning to change. Life, fate, destiny, or whatever you choose to believe in, appears to be rearranging pieces behind the scenes. This person is finding their way back toward you, and what they are bringing with them may catch you completely by surprise. Take another moment before you continue. This is not just a random message that happened to cross your path. It arrived because something within you was ready to receive it. Somewhere in your story, there is a person who went quiet. Maybe they stepped away. Maybe they acted as though they had moved on. Maybe they behaved as if you were simply a chapter that had already been closed and left behind. Yet something inside them has shifted recently. Something subtle, but significant. And they are coming. Not to exchange small talk, not to casually reconnect. They are coming because there is a truth living inside them that has become too heavy to carry alone. And when they finally speak it aloud, it may leave you stunned. Now let's explore why this may have always been destined to happen. Some connections simply refuse to follow ordinary rules. Time doesn't always dissolve them. Distance doesn't necessarily weaken them. Silence doesn't automatically erase them. And chances are, you've already felt traces of this yourself. Perhaps you've thought about this person unexpectedly, without any clear reason. Perhaps a song, a place, or a passing comment suddenly reminded you of them. Maybe you've woken from a dream with their face still lingering in your mind. Maybe you've felt a wave of emotion rise within you that seemed impossible to explain. These experiences often feel random, yet they can seem deeply connected to something unresolved. This person tried to sever those invisible ties. They filled their schedule. They distracted themselves. They told themselves they were over it. They convinced themselves that everything was fine. And perhaps during the daylight hours, they almost believed it. But late at night, when the noise faded and the distractions disappeared, you remained there in their thoughts. You kept returning to their mind. And eventually, that kind of quiet, persistent ache compels a person to act. On the surface, they probably appear composed. They likely seem as though they have everything under control. But beneath that exterior, a conflict has been unfolding. They replay moments the two of you shared. They hear echoes of your voice in memory. They ask themselves difficult questions. Why do they still feel this way? Why has no one else truly compared? Why are you still the person who occupies so much space within their thoughts? The answers unsettle them because those answers point toward a reality they tried not to acknowledge. You mattered more than they ever admitted. They are confronting a difficult truth now. They didn't lose you simply because circumstances failed to align. They lost you because they didn't show up the way they should have. And that realization weighs heavily on a person. It is not an easy burden to carry. You may wonder why, if they felt all of this, they remained silent for so long. The answer is often fear. Fear of how you would respond. Fear that you had moved forward and found peace without them. Fear of rejection. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of looking honestly at their own mistakes and shortcomings. Remaining silent felt safer. But silence carries its own consequences. Every day they chose not to reach out, the weight became heavier. The truth grew louder. Eventually, silence stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like a prison. Something happened recently that broke through the walls they had carefully built. It may have been something seemingly small, something they saw, something they heard about you. a lonely moment that struck differently than before. A realization that time was moving forward while important words remained unspoken. Whatever it was, it pierced through the defenses they had relied on for so long. And in that moment, a decision formed. Not from impulse, not from temporary emotion, not from a passing mood, but from a place much deeper within them. They decided they needed to speak, and when they do, it won't be a casual conversation. They aren't coming merely to catch up or make things less uncomfortable. They are coming to express the things they buried, the words their pride refused to release, the regrets they have quietly carried, the emotions they convinced themselves had disappeared. For a long time, you may have believed they were unaffected. You may have assumed they moved on without looking back. Yet the reality may be far different from what it appeared. They felt far more than they showed. They simply didn't know how to express it. Or perhaps they were too afraid to try. And when that truth finally emerges, it has the potential to surprise you. What you're describing is not merely a moment. It is a threshold. The kind of threshold that arrives quietly rather than dramatically. It doesn't announce itself with certainty. It doesn't demand attention. Instead, it gathers strength gradually through distance, silence, reflection, and the often uncomfortable process of self-awareness. By the time it fully arrives, it carries tremendous weight. Not only because of what is about to be said, but because of everything that remained unsaid until now. They did not arrive at this realization overnight. People often imagine that apologies emerge from sudden inspiration or emotional overwhelm. But the kind of honesty being described here, the kind that requires someone to set aside pride, usually develops slowly. It takes shape in private moments. Moments where there is no audience, no one to impress, no one to argue with, no image to protect. Only a person sitting alone with their thoughts, gradually confronting the reality of what they lost and the role they played in losing it. That is not a comfortable place to be, because admitting I was wrong in a situation like this is about much more than acknowledging a mistake. It requires dismantling an identity. It requires letting go of the version of themselves that justified every choice. The version that protected them from guilt. The version that insisted they had done everything they could. The version that explained away what happened by saying it simply wasn't meant to be. True self-awareness asks for something different. It asks for clarity. It asks for honesty. It asks them to look directly at the possibility that something meaningful entered their life, and they failed to meet it with the care it deserved. That realization doesn't feel triumphant. It feels heavy. Yet they remained with it. They didn't continue running from it. They didn't completely bury it beneath distractions, new experiences, or convenient explanations. Or perhaps they tried to at first. Maybe they told themselves they would move on. Maybe they believed someone else would eventually take your place. Maybe they convinced themselves that what the two of you shared was valuable, but not necessarily rare. Perhaps they searched for similar feelings elsewhere. Perhaps they attempted to recreate the connection through someone new. Perhaps they tried to prove to themselves that meaningful connections are easily replaced. But that's where a deeper truth began to emerge. Comparison has a way of revealing what truly mattered. When someone finds themselves measuring every experience that follows against one that came before, it often means that earlier experience left a lasting imprint. Not necessarily because it was perfect, not because one person was better than everyone else, but because something about it carried a depth that could not be ignored. Something about how you cared, something about how you listened, something about how you showed up, something about the way you made them feel understood. All of it created an internal reference point. And when nothing else quite reaches that same place within them, the mind begins to reconsider what it once dismissed. That is one of the unexpected gifts of time apart. When used honestly, distance removes immediacy. It removes much of the emotional noise that can cloud perception while two people are still deeply entangled in a situation. It creates room for reflection. It allows patterns to become visible. It gives behavior a chance to be examined from a wider perspective. In that space, meaning begins to settle. Lessons become clearer. Regrets become harder to ignore, and truths become increasingly difficult to avoid. Time apart does not always lead people back to each other. It does not guarantee reconciliation. It does not promise a second chance. But very often, it leads to clarity. And clarity can be a powerful thing. Because once a person sees the truth clearly, once they stop hiding behind excuses and distractions, once they fully understand what a connection meant and how their choices affected it, they can no longer pretend they don't know. That awareness changes something inside them. It creates a crossroads. One path leads back into silence, where they continue carrying everything alone. The other path requires courage. It requires vulnerability. It requires them to speak. And more often than not, when the truth has become impossible to ignore, people eventually choose the second path. Not because it's easy, not because they're certain of the outcome, but because some truths become too important to remain unspoken. And when those truths are finally shared, they have the power to change far more than a conversation. They can change the way two people understand their past. They can change the meaning attached to old memories. They can change the story each person has been telling themselves about what happened. And sometimes, they can open a door that both people believed had already closed. Whether that door leads to reconciliation, closure, understanding, or simply peace, only time can reveal. But what matters most is that the truth finally finds its voice. Because some connections leave marks that distance cannot erase. Some lessons take years to fully understand, and some feelings, no matter how deeply buried, continue waiting patiently for the moment when they can finally be acknowledged. That moment may be closer than either of you realizes, and clarity is what ultimately brought them to this point. Not certainty, not expectation, simply clarity. They don't know how you'll respond. They don't know whether what they feel now will be enough to rebuild something that was once broken. They don't know if you've moved forward in ways that make this conversation arrive too late. But they do know one thing. Keeping it inside would stay with them forever. There is a particular kind of regret that doesn't disappear with time. It doesn't gradually soften. It doesn't become easier to carry. Instead, it remains quietly present in the background, persistent and unresolved, because something genuine existed and was never fully acknowledged for what it truly was. They've reached a point where they no longer want to carry that weight. And that decision, to face you, to speak honestly, to risk rejection rather than continue hiding behind silence, is significant. Not because it guarantees a specific outcome, but because it reflects a transformation within them. The version of themselves that avoided difficult conversations, that failed to fully understand what was in front of them, that couldn't meet you where you were emotionally, could never have done this. That version couldn't stand before you and say, without excuses or self-protection, "I didn't know how to love you the way you deserved." That statement alone reveals something important. It shows that something has changed. But this is also the point where your role becomes just as important as theirs. Because it would be easy, understandably easy, to view this moment through the lens of hope. It would be easy to see their return as confirmation that what you felt all along was mutual. To believe that the connection meant as much to them as it did to you. To see this as the beginning of something being restored. And perhaps it is. But perhaps it isn't. That is why awareness matters more than hope in a moment like this. Hope, when it isn't grounded in reality, has a way of pulling people back into old emotional patterns. It can encourage you to overlook what doesn't align. It can tempt you to minimize what feels off. It can make you rush toward resolution before the full truth has had an opportunity to reveal itself. Awareness does something different. Awareness keeps you present. It allows you to listen not only to what they are saying, but also to how they are saying it. It invites you to observe not only their words, but also their energy, their consistency, their sincerity, and their willingness to take responsibility without deflecting or softening the truth. Because words, meaningful as they may be, are only the beginning. Anyone can express regret. Anyone can explain what they understand now. Anyone can say exactly the right thing in a moment filled with emotion and vulnerability. What truly matters is what comes afterward. Do they move differently after this conversation? Do their actions reflect the insight they claim to have gained? Do they demonstrate through consistency, effort, and accountability that they are capable of meeting you in a way they couldn't before? That is where the real answer exists. And you're in a position now where you can actually recognize that answer more clearly than before, because you're not the same person you once were when everything fell apart. You've had your own journey. You've spent your own time sitting with questions, confusion, disappointment, and loss. You've had to make sense of things without receiving the explanations you wanted. You've had to rebuild parts of yourself that were impacted by how everything ended. Experiences like that change a person. They sharpen perception. They deepen understanding. They clarify what you need, what you value, and what you are no longer willing to accept. They ground you in ways that were impossible before you walked through those experiences. So when this meeting happens, you're not arriving from a place of longing alone. You're arriving from a place of knowing. Knowing what it felt like to be with them, knowing what it felt like to lose them, knowing what it required to move through that loss and reconnect with yourself again. Those lessons do not disappear simply because they've returned. And that is why this moment is just as much about you as it is about them. Because while they are arriving to express something, you are arriving to evaluate something. Not in a defensive way, not in a guarded way, but in a grounded and honest way. You are there to determine whether what they are offering now aligns with the person you have become. That is a different kind of strength, not strength over someone else, but strength within yourself. The kind of inner steadiness that allows you to remain centered even while something deeply emotional unfolds in front of you. The kind that allows you to listen completely without immediately reacting. The kind that allows you to absorb what is being said without losing your sense of self in the process. And there may come a moment when they are standing in front of you and everything becomes very still. It may be brief, it may be subtle, but you'll feel it. Before your mind begins analyzing, before you start constructing a response, before old fears or hopes rush in, there will be a moment of recognition. Something inside you will register the reality of what is happening, not the story you've created about it, not the fears attached to it, not the hopes attached to it, simply the reality of what is present. That is the moment to trust. Not your assumptions, not your expectations, but the quiet awareness within you that has been shaped by everything you've lived through. Because that awareness will tell you whether what is standing before you is aligned or not. And whatever it tells you, you are capable of responding to it. That is the part people often overlook. Many become so focused on the outcome, whether they will reunite, whether things will work this time, whether the connection can be restored, that they forget the most important part of the experience, how they choose to show up within it. You don't need all the answers immediately. You don't need to decide the future in a single conversation. You don't need to determine where everything is headed before you've had time to process what is being offered. You simply need to be present enough to receive what is being shared, and honest enough to respond from where you genuinely are. That may mean asking difficult questions. It may mean expressing what you experienced during the time apart. It may mean establishing clear boundaries. It may mean saying that you need time to think. It may mean recognizing that, although feelings still exist, something within you has changed, and you cannot return in the same way you once would have. All of those responses are valid. Because this moment is not about recreating the past. It is about deciding what, if anything, can exist in the present. And that decision does not need to be rushed. What matters is that it is authentic. Because authenticity is what this entire moment revolves around. Truth. Not the version of the relationship that existed before, not the idealized version of what it could become, but the truth of what it was, the truth of what it is now, and the truth of what it realistically has the potential to become. Truth has a remarkable quality. When it is fully expressed, it tends to create peace regardless of the outcome. If there is still something meaningful that can be rebuilt, that reality will reveal itself over time. Not only through words, but through sustained effort, through consistency, through accountability, through a willingness to make different choices than before. And if there is not, that reality will reveal itself as well. But either way, something important reaches resolution. Something that once remained unfinished. Something that lingered quietly in the background of your life. Something that never felt completely understood. Finally comes into focus. And clarity allows you to move forward without carrying unanswered questions. That is not a small thing, because unresolved connections have a way of staying with us, not always in obvious ways, but often in subtle ones. They shape how we approach future relationships. They influence how easily we trust. They affect how open or guarded we allow ourselves to become. When something like this is finally brought into the light, it loosens that hold. It creates an opportunity to fully understand what you experienced, not only emotionally, but also meaningfully. To recognize that what you felt was real, that it mattered, that it carried depth, that it left an impact. And that truth remains meaningful regardless of whether the relationship continues. Because not every important connection is measured by how long it lasts. Some are measured by how deeply they change the people involved. And when you can see that clearly, with honesty and without illusion, something inside you becomes free. Free from uncertainty, free from unanswered questions, free to move forward with understanding instead of doubt. And sometimes that understanding becomes the greatest gift the connection was ever meant to offer. Because one of the quiet concerns people often carry after a meaningful connection ends is the question of whether it was ever truly mutual, whether they imagined the depth, whether they cared more than the other person, whether the connection held a different meaning for them than it did for the one they loved. This moment answers those questions, not in theory, not through assumptions or speculation, but in a lived and tangible way. They're standing in front of you, choosing honesty, choosing to acknowledge what they couldn't acknowledge before, choosing to risk discomfort, vulnerability, and possible rejection in order to express something genuine. That doesn't happen without feeling. That doesn't happen without significance. And while it doesn't automatically mean the relationship should continue or inevitably will continue, it does reveal something important. You didn't imagine it. You didn't misunderstand what was there. You weren't wrong for loving the way you did. And that's something worth holding on to, because it speaks to who you are, not only within this connection, but within every meaningful connection you'll experience moving forward. What you're holding on to here is something many people spend years trying to question, suppress, unlearn, or protect themselves from: the ability to love deeply, the willingness to show up fully, the capacity to invest not only attention, but genuine presence. And somewhere along the way, often through disappointment, heartbreak, or emotional imbalance, that instinct begins to feel like a weakness instead of a gift. But it was never the problem. The challenge was never your ability to care. The challenge was where that care was placed, how it was received, and whether it was met with the same level of awareness, emotional maturity, readiness, and responsibility. When something meaningful falls apart, especially after you've offered it your full sincerity, the mind naturally searches for an explanation. And one of the easiest conclusions to reach is this: maybe I cared too much. Maybe I gave too much. Maybe I should have held back. At first, that conclusion feels protective. It creates the illusion that next time, by being less open, less expressive, less invested, and less emotionally available, you'll avoid experiencing the same pain again. But what it actually does is distance you from one of your greatest strengths. Because the ability to care deeply is not something that needs to be reduced in order to be safe. It is something that needs to be directed wisely. It becomes powerful when it's placed in an environment where it can grow, where it can be valued, and where it can be met rather than taken for granted. You don't improve a meaningful trait by shrinking it. You refine it by understanding it. And understanding it means recognizing something important. Depth of feeling is not what creates pain. Misalignment is. Pain often emerges when two people are standing in different emotional realities. When one person is more aware than the other. When one person is more ready than the other. When one person is willing to engage with the reality of what's forming between them, while the other is still trying to understand what they feel. An imbalance develops. And that imbalance creates tension. It creates confusion. It creates situations where one person is trying to build something real, while the other remains uncertain about what they're capable of offering. That is not a failure of love. It is often a difference in timing, a difference in readiness, a difference in emotional clarity. And those differences are what make experiences like this so difficult to navigate. They exist in an in-between space where something real is present, yet not fully supported by both people in the way it needs to be. So when you look back at how much you gave, how openly you showed up, how sincerely you cared, don't reinterpret those qualities as mistakes. Don't convince yourself they were things you should have done differently. See them for what they truly were. An honest expression of who you are. Because that part of you didn't ruin anything. It revealed something. It revealed the depth you're capable of bringing into a connection. It revealed the kind of bond you naturally create when you're not hiding behind fear. It revealed what it feels like to experience something that goes beyond the surface. Something with emotional weight. Something with meaning. Something with significance. And that matters. Not because it guarantees every future connection will succeed, but because it establishes a standard. It provides a reference point for what genuine connection actually feels like. Not the idealized fantasy of it, not the version imagined from a distance, but the lived experience of being emotionally present with another person in a real and meaningful way. Many people spend their entire lives without fully encountering that. So rather than questioning that part of yourself, the real shift happens in how you carry it forward. Not with hesitation, not with fear,